to navigate this moment in history well, we're going to need a mature economic toolset. And most of this video will be me laying out what that actually means. But there's also this meta purpose to the video, so I want to address that first. And that is, I've been doing this series on David Graeber's book, Debt. And the biggest disagreement I have with him is over his strawman mythologies about how economists think. And my last video I did was on the need for collaboration between pro-map and anti-map groups, where that video looked at pro-woke, anti-woke, pro-religion, anti-religion. But the key here is that the pro-map people see the positive and hopeful uses of a map, the transformative uses of a map. The anti-map people are more focused on the abuses of that map. And the disagreement between Graeber and I is actually kind of a pro-map, anti-map disagreement. And I think it has the typical grounds of contempt that you see in a lot of these debates. Here's the thing. We actually agree on quite a bit. We both think that a healthier system is going to require a different set of economic myths. We both believe that there will need to be paradigm shifts in our economic system. That's like the whole premise of my channel. So in that agreement, we both kind of agree on this. We should be collaborating. People like me and people like him should be collaborating over these things. And I don't see that happening nearly enough. So let me give it to you straight. When I hear someone saying economists think everyone is selfish and fully rational, when I hear that, my reaction is, oh, this person does not want to understand. And the odd thing about this point of contempt is that both sides believe that their perspective is backed up with experience. He thinks that whenever he reads economists and talks to economists, he's getting this understanding of how they're thinking. And my experience is that whenever I talk to somebody who starts with this assumption, they are projecting that onto anything I say. And I'm like, turn off the projector. This is not what I'm saying. And they can't turn off the projector. That's my experience. So what is a mature understanding of the economic toolset? And I would claim there's a couple of pieces to this, at least that I'll talk about in this video. One is that a mature understanding of economics understands that Econ 101 is a developmental stage and accepts that there may need to be some developmental stages that people go through to reach a different type of understanding, that there will be scaffolding in those earlier stages that will be helpful later on. And then a second part of a mature economics is a comfort with ambiguity in some of the parts of the economic model. So is human behavior all deliberative? And mature economists know, no, of course not. The models do not require deliberative thought. That's not how these models work at all. But it's also not deliberative. It is ambiguously deliberative. And thinking about how that ambiguity works and how it works within the context of our models, that's important. And then the same thing with selfishness. Are people purely selfishly motivated? No. Are people purely altruistically motivated? No. And the type of ambiguity that makes up drives and human behavior, if you haven't really wrestled deeply with that, both looking at the real world and trying to figure out what's going on there, but then going back and forth between that and the models, if you haven't done a lot of that regarding the ambiguity around selfishness, then you don't have a mature understanding of the economic toolset. And let me add one asterisk here, which is I am not claiming that all economists have the kind of mature understanding of the toolset that I'm describing in this video. That is not my claim at all. And I will return in other videos to this contentious understanding or misunderstanding between David Graeber and I over these misperceptions of each other or perceptions of each other, because there's going to be truth on both sides and distorted perception on both sides. And in thinking this through, I've actually learned a lot about these pro-map, anti-map dialogues and how they get stuck. So I will lay that out in other videos. To start off, I am going to pull some quotes from this book. And so I do want to say that McGilchrist might not agree with a lot of what I'm saying in this video. Now, here's my intuition about McGilchrist. My intuition from reading his stuff is that he has not spent a lot of time in economics space, that he hasn't gone deep with this particular field. He does actually say things that are similar to Graeber occasionally, but it tends to be saying it and moving on relatively quickly. He does not make these broad sweeping claims about how economists think. And I take that to be him embodying some of the epistemic humility that goes along with his philosophy throughout these books. So I do not get the same sense of contempt from McGilchrist that I do from Graeber. But who knows? I don't know. And whether or not he has the same perspective as Graeber, I am still going to use his stuff. If you put your stuff out in the world, you might have it used in ways you don't agree with. That's just something about being in the conversation. So let me start out with a McGilchrist quote. McGilchrist defines cynicism as the negative belief that self-interest drives human behavior. Now, one thing I want to point out about cynicism is there are definitely people who are cynical about everything. But a more common stance is somebody who's cynical, who's projecting the negative beliefs onto the out-group and not cynical about the in-group. I think that's a different setup. With cynicism, if you look at any human action that you could observe in the real world, you will be able to project onto that selfish motives. You will be able to come up with some reason where that person is only doing that for a self-serving reason. Take some examples here. Giving to charity, mowing someone's lawn when their loved one is in the hospital for a long time, listening to an old person tell their stories for hours on end. All three of those things, you can come up with reasons. They're just status seeking, they're just trying to feed their own self-esteem. You can come up with self-serving reasons that might drive that particular behavior. If some drive inside of you wants to project that onto them, that wish will be granted. You can do that. But my claim here is that just because you can project something onto somebody does not mean that's the reality of the situation. And wrestling with this fact is the key to deepening your understanding of economics. I'd like to make two comments based on this example. And one has to do with the ambiguous nature of selfishness in human behavior, and the other has to do with Graeber projecting this onto economists. Let's start with the ambiguity point. And one thing that McGilchrist says in his book, and his book, of course, is about perceiving the reality of the world and then coming back to our models. And I'm not going to explain left brain and right brain here, but essentially, the proper way to use maps, and economic tools are maps, right? The proper way to use those is to first start by looking at reality and trying to discern what is going on in reality. And then you take that reality to the maps. You might play around with that reality, and then after you've played around with the maps and the intuitions you got from reality, then you take it back to the real world and see, does this map actually map onto what I'm seeing in reality? So the key is, it's a sandwich with reality on both sides. Developing a mature understanding of any economic tool set is going to require this. And the other thing about that is you cannot get this just by learning the map, right? In Econ 101 classes or Physics 101 classes or whatever, you learn something that is the map somebody else has put together. But to actually understand how it works, you have to, on your own, do this back and forth thing. And that's the developmental process. That takes a really long time. A lot of the understandings you come up with are shower moment understandings, where you're kind of wrestling with the tools of the map and you're like, wait a second, that doesn't seem to match reality. Are both of these true? Does the map assume that's not there? And you hold on to both of them. You're like, I can't make these fit. And then sometime when you're in the shower and your brain is just going, you're like, oh, I see how this works. And these are not moments that you can have through instruction, through a course, through doing a problem set. These are moments that have to be driven by curiosity and observing the real world and causing the interaction between the map and reality to make things more in focus or more vivid. This is just how development always works. So when you're watching in the real world as people do altruistic things, what you kind of discover and intuit is that sometimes they do those things for selfish reasons. And sometimes they do those things for generous reasons. And sometimes it's both at once. And sometimes you can't really tell, but you're intuiting one way or another way. And it's actually genuinely ambiguous when you're looking at real human behavior in the real world. Not only this, but people have multiple drives within themselves. Sometimes they have conflicts between the different personalities within themselves. And of course, the economics toolset can model those conflicts just like anything else, right? But coming to terms with this ambiguity that looking at any one given situation or modeling the different competing drives in somebody, that requires this flexibility of thought to think about it properly. And one mode of thought that our modern world is trying to impose on us is to say, never make any claims about anybody's motives. Never say they're doing this for selfish reasons, that's disrespectful, or never say they're doing this for altruistic reasons, just leave it be. And that is not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the kind of ambiguity that I think is reasonable and helpful and that needs to be dealt with. Because you cannot go through life without intuitions about what is driving a person. To navigate the world appropriately, sometimes you need to trust somebody, and sometimes you need to be a little bit skeptical, and you have to use your intuition that's developed over time watching reality to figure out which it is. You also have to know that you're going to be wrong a lot of the time, and that doesn't mean that you stop trying to understand that people have motives and desires and there's impetus behind people's action. And sometimes that impetus is not the thing that's the most straightforward. So when I'm talking about ambiguity here, it is not ambiguity about not having a viewpoint on what's driving somebody to give to charity or to help their neighbor with their groceries. The kind of ambiguity I'm talking about is it's this flexible ambiguity that is the type that real people use when they try to navigate the world. And that needs to go back and forth with the maps of economics if you're going to develop a mature way of understanding the economic toolset. The other point I wanted to make regarding cynicism is that if you look at Graeber's projection onto economists, he's projecting cynicism onto everything we say. Every use of our model, he's like, there it is. That is assuming selfishness. And if you can project that onto anyone you're looking at in the real world, you also will be able to project that onto anyone talking about economics or talking about human behavior where they can't rule out the selfish motive. They're thinking about it ambiguously. There's almost no case where you can say, definitely this person is doing this for a non-selfish reason. You have to leave some space, some breathing room for both possibilities. And because of that, it's always going to be possible to interpret something as being about the purely selfish when that's not what it is. And let me give you a McGilchrist quote on ambiguity. There is an important role for ambiguity in all understanding, something which metaphor, symbol, humor, tone of voice, and all the implicit modes of expression of the arts, best understood by the right hemisphere, imply. This is not ambiguity in the sense of just not having taken proper trouble to pin down the meaning, but in the sense of having indeed taken proper trouble not to pin down the meaning too closely, so as to let it live. The proper rigor of ambiguity. I love that. The proper rigor of ambiguity is part of the process of learning something that inherently involves something as deep and complex as human beings. this. Next, I want to think about the nature of developmental stages. And in this book, he talks a lot about physics. And if you turn to a Physics 101 textbook, you're going to get the idea of a particle, and you're going to get this image of, the circling of the particle, and you know the image I'm talking about. And one claim he makes here is that for physicists with an advanced understanding of physics, they actually do not understand this little model to be true at all. Like, the notion of a particle in that form is actually kind of false. And yet, let me give you 3 different people, and I want to ask you the question, who is closest to the truth and who is farthest from the truth? So one, you've got somebody on the internet who is really just looking for fuel to take people down and tell people they're stupid. And they learn this fact that the diagram of the particle in physics is wrong. And this internet troll points to the sophomore in college who's taking Physics 101 and says, "You're totally wrong. That fact you think is reality, that's not reality." And yet the impetus behind the internet troll is not in any way oriented toward what is going on with physics. Their impetus is entirely directed at taking down the sophomore, at making themselves feel smarter than the sophomore. There's the college sophomore who genuinely believes that particles exist in the form in their textbook, but their orientation is toward the truth. They're trying to understand something about the fabric of reality. Their orientation is true, but their model is false. And then there's a physicist who has matured in their understanding of physics, and this physicist says to another physicist, that understanding in our textbooks is wrong. Thinking about those 3 people, I would definitely argue that the internet troll is way farther from the truth than the sophomore in college who believes the incorrect thing. And of course, I'm making the same argument about economics. I'm saying, okay, what you get in an Econ 101 textbook it's scaffolding. It is wrong, but it is designed to move someone closer to something that does have a reality to it. When I teach economics to students encountering this material for the first time, one of the things I have to do is make things as visualizable as possible, because people think in visual images. So we talk about weighing the costs and the benefits, and it seems like it's deliberative because that's the easiest way to make this visualizable, is you're imagining somebody sitting there and they're weighing the benefits, they're weighing the costs. Now, when you advance, you realize, wait a second, it's not somebody sitting there deliberatively weighing benefits and costs. It's something in somebody's gut that leads them towards something or away from something based on gut reactions. And those gut reactions can be genetically programmed. They can be based on experience, like the hand on the hot stove. They can be based on stories that are essentially vicarious experience, where your friend told you, oh my gosh, the stove was hot and I put my hand on it and it was horrible. I had to go to the hospital. And just hearing that story and visualizing their experience can be encoded in the human psyche and the human instinctive reaction system as if it were learned experience. And then, of course, there's sort of the collective wisdom, where the collective environment may be doing something like weighing costs and benefits. But we pick this up just by following norms and doing what other people do. That's kind of an instinctive behavior, even if maybe at one point in the construction of the collective conscience, there was a weighing of costs and benefits. So it's actually really complex when we talk about what motivates human behavior. And with economic models, if you go to Wikipedia, you're going to see a whole bunch of different variations on what people mean when they say rationality. And the deliberative type of rationality, that's used in some circles, but that's not the economics model type of rationality. The economics model type of rationality has to do with pursuit. And Pursuit does not have to be deliberative. A lion pursues a gazelle, and that's coming from the lion's gut. As a matter of fact, when you first start learning economics, the decisions you're modeling are very concrete. It's like, how many t-shirts do you buy right now? And as you move through a maturing phase in terms of dealing with these models, you can handle much more abstract things like ways of being, such as how many times in the family reunion weekend does Aunt Marge talk about her kids? She's definitely not weighing costs and benefits about talking about her kids. That's coming from her gut, from ways of being that work for her. And yet, there are forces that drive those. So could you model those? Yes. Can you model them perfectly? No. Part of understanding a tool set is knowing its limits, knowing how it can be used, the creative ways it can be used, and knowing its limits. And yet, when I teach economics, even to seniors in college, I will not allow them, when they build their own models, to have a choice variable that is ways of being. Even though if they were to go a couple more years and go to graduate school, I would totally allow that. I don't allow it in my senior classes because I first need to see that the student is wrestling with the more stereotypical types of action to sort of get a strong intuition for the relationships of a choice variable and an exogenous variable, and how does that play out with nonlinearities. I need to be able to see them wrestling with that before I'm comfortable with them moving into this more abstract space of how you work with models. And yes, I have my students build their own models and play around with those models to see what happens when there's this weird nonlinearity. How does that map onto what you're seeing in your college dorm and how people are behaving in their college dorm? This really is about playing with models. And playing with economic models is actually quite a bit like playing with dolls as a child. Does a child learn social intelligence through playing with dolls? Maybe. It's certainly not the only factor, but why do girls like playing with dolls? Well, it's just instinctive, but they're also sort of developing out their intuitions for those relationships. And I definitely remember being 12 years old and going over to babysit for somebody, and we played with dolls, and I was kind of like, I know I'm too old for this, but this is so fun. And then I got to college and I discovered economics and realized I could play with dolls for the rest of my life. And I do think there is something about doing these little thought experiments where you're playing and you're seeing how it works with the dolls and mapping it to reality that really can help somebody develop their thinking about human behavior. So clearly we should force boys to play with dolls, and then they might grow up to have high social intelligence, right? No. But the point I'm making here is that we are in a situation as a society where people are treating other people like things. People are treating other people without looking at the reality, without seeing the reality of those people's real desires and needs. And one question you might ask is the reason for this the fact that people are playing with dolls? And I'm making the case that actually no, having the models, having the dolls, having these things where we practice thinking about human motivation and relationships, that's not necessarily the cause of why people are treating each other like objects. I would say it's the loss of looking at reality, not the existence of the dolls and the models, that is behind this. I think I'll generally leave it there. But I will say there are so many other things I could have said in this vein in this video about the economic tools and the way they don't work the way people think they work when they first encounter the tool set in an Econ 101 textbook or classroom. And so what I'm going to do about this, I'm going to do a series on my other channel, which is just my economics lectures channel, that kind of goes through some of these ways of deepening your understanding of economics. Even though they're not things that you can get through instruction, I stick with that claim. But I think you can kind of get a sense for where is the nose of my boat pointed when I'm trying to understand this stuff. And one last thing I want to say here. When people hear my reaction, when I hear people speaking like David Graeber does, my reaction is, this person does not want to understand economics. That may seem kind of ungenerous and kind of even contemptuous according to my definition of contempt. And I want to say about that, this is a rule of thumb. And it's a rule of thumb that I actually do stick with, but that doesn't mean it's 100% true. As a matter of fact, it's definitely not 100% true. Some people really want to understand, but it's just the way our culture trains us to understand things will not allow a person to understand without the kind of flexibility I'm talking about here. So I really do not hold people in contempt who have this viewpoint. Actually, I think there are going to be many valid reasons that that is a great rule of thumb for some people. And I promise you, I will give David Graeber credit, including credit for this very statement I've been arguing against in my video, Are Economists the Villains?, whenever that comes out.